With the latest God of War title, it sort of tested my thoughts as to which games are beat-em-ups, which ones are hack and slashes, and maybe even ones that are without a clear answer. So let's try to find that out. I'll be using Wikipedia to help define these terms, since I couldn't find any other website that even attempts to do so. The first game that was widely accepted as a beat-em-up appears to be Kung Fu Master that came out in 1984. The first traits that jump out to me as a beat-em-up are its hand-to-hand combat with little to no weapon usage as a fighting game, and the fact that you fight against multiple enemies at once as opposed to 1-versus-1 oriented fighting games. Throughout looking at many games, there's nothing that I could find that really conflicts with this idea. There's unfortunately not as much as I could find on hack and slashes, but the game that appears to be the first widely accepted hack and slash would be Golden Axe. The traits that jump out to me for this game include the multiple enemies, similar to before, but with a large focus on melee weapons, particularly sharp-edged ones. Games typically known as hack and slashes afterward also appear to follow this design quite heavily as well, making me wonder why there needs to be a distinction in the first place. Still, I think it's fair to say that most games that are beat-em-ups, at the very least, feel different than most hack and slashes, so I guess I'll just go with it. There are some games out there that are a little bit more difficult to define, so let's go over those real quick. What is the Soulsborne series? Typically you'd think it would be a hack and slash due to its heavy reliance on weaponry against multiple enemies. It too has a heavy reliance on weaponry, albeit not always weaponry of hacks or slashes. First off, the Soulsborne series appears to be better known as primarily an action RPG franchise due to its progression system, real-time combat that includes ranged weapons such as magic and guns, as well as other RPG mechanics. Dead Rising, however, I think of more as a hybrid, but with mostly beat-em-up characteristics. Finally, we're back to God of War. It has both melee with hack and slash weapons like its previous installments, and fighting with your fists. It's also more personal, with an over-the-shoulder third-person camera and slower, more methodical combat. I think the closest thing that I could call it is a hybrid between action and adventure, because of how its story and traditional action are driven, but it also has hack and slash elements. Since the fist-based combat seems to be a bit minimal, I wouldn't really call it a beat-em-up. Still, I mentioned hybrid, and I think that's an important thing to mention. I think most games are easy to define and characterize within specific genres, but I also think there's a point where we should recognize that there's at least some uncertainty to be had within games. For example, BioShock is simply called a first-person shooter, and The Last of Us is simply called an action-adventure survival horror game. But those don't at all give a good idea of even the combat for those games, since they're so different from most other games within those genres. Some games are noticeably harder to define than others, and I think that's due to their innovation in pushing the boundaries for what we typically think of for specific genres. Overall, as I mentioned before, I think God of War can be somewhat defined as an action-adventure game with hack-and-slash themes. But, otherwise, I think it's unclear, and I don't think that's a bad thing.